The summer of 1887 baked the Wyoming Territory until the red hills shimmered and the scorched grass gave up a smell like old bones. Dust, fine as flour, settled on everything in Red Butte, coating windowsills and filling the lines in a man's face. It was a season of thirst, for water and for justice, and both were growing scarce. The big cattle outfits, their herds numbering in the thousands, were stringing new barbed wire fences across the range, choking off the smaller homesteads from the creeks that had always run for everyone. Each train that chugged into town brought more wire, more hired men with cold eyes, and the feeling that a war fought with fences and whispers was about to be won by the man with the most money. May Carter felt the heat in her bones. At 23, she moved with the quiet purpose of someone who had learned early that life gave no quarter. Her hands, though slender, were calloused from handling reins and mending harnesses. She had a way with horses, a silent language of touch and low murmurs that could gentle the most spooked mare. Her dream was a simple one, a small horse ranch of her own on the green slopes of Cottonwood Hill, a place where the wind blew clean and the only fence was the one she built herself. But the hills were brown now, and her dream felt as distant as the clouds that refused to gather. From the shade of the livery stable, she watched the horse auction. The air was thick with the clatter of hooves on hard-packed earth, the rhythmic chant of the auctioneer, and the sharp scent of manure and sweat. Men stood in knots, hats tipped back, judging horseflesh with narrowed eyes. Among them, lean and self-contained, was Luke Ramsey. He was 25. A man made of long muscle and quiet decency. He worked as a seasonal cowboy, his life a rhythm of long cattle drives and brief returns to Red Butte. He did not own much more than his saddle and the clothes on his back, but he could ride anything with 4 legs, and his skill with a rope was a local legend. He was not looking at the horses. His gaze was fixed on May, a silent, steady watch he had kept since they were children sharing a stolen apple behind the blacksmith's shop. His love for her was a patient, unspoken thing, as constant as the northern star in the vast, lonely sky. He wore a neckerchief the color of dried clay, a faded patch of color against his sun-darkened skin. It was always the same one. A shadow fell over the auction yard, a presence that made men shift their weight and fall silent. Silas Van Dorn stepped out from the offices of the Red Butte Bank and Trust, a building he owned just as he owned the largest cattle ranch in the territory. He was a man in his 40s, thick in the chest and neck, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun. He did not smile. He assessed. Everything was a commodity to him, the land, the water, the people. He moved with the slow, confident swagger of a man who knew the rules were his to make. At his side, as always, was Sheriff Tolliver, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his vest and whose eyes darted about, never settling. Like a coyote sniffing for an easy meal, the sheriff owed Van Dorn more than money. He owed him his position, a debt he repaid with selective enforcement of the law. Behind them, lingering near the church doors across the street, stood Reverend Hale, his Bible held like a shield. The Reverend preached of order and divine will, and his sermons often aligned perfectly with Silas Van Dorn's earthly ambitions. Van Dorn wanted it all. He wanted the grass, the creeks, and the deep wells. He was buying up quit claims, foreclosing on loans, and using the law like a club. His newest fence cut a sharp line across the horizon, a glittering thread of steel barbs that declared all on the other side was his. May turned away from the auction, the sight of Van Dorn making a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. The problem wasn't just the land or the water. It was the bill from Dr. Merriweather tucked away in a tin box in her small house. Her mother's cough had been a terrible, racking thing all through the past winter, a sickness that clung to the lungs and stole the breath. The doctor had come every week, his medicines costly but necessary. The debt was a heavy stone, and Silas Van Dorn had offered to lift it. His proposal had been delivered not with courtship, but with the cold logic of a business transaction. He had come to their small home, his large frame filling the doorway, blocking the light. He had spoken of her mother's health, of the coming harsh winter, of the security a woman needed. And then, the offer. Marry him, and the debt would be forgotten, cancelled. A simple exchange. Her freedom for her mother's care. The town had already passed its verdict. She heard the whispers when she went to the mercantile. A poor girl needs a roof more than she needs pride, one woman had muttered to another over a bolt of calico. Van Dorn's a hard man, but he's a rich one. The words were like burrs, sticking to her, making her feel small and trapped. They did not see the cage, they only saw the gilded door. She walked past the Copper Spurs saloon. Laughter and the tinny notes of a piano spilled out into the dusty street. Through the swinging doors, she saw cowboys drinking away their pay. Their faces flushed. It was a place of noise and forgetting. Her life felt silent and heavy with things she could not forget. Further down, a pair of crows perched on the new fence line, their black eyes gleaming. They cawed. A harsh, grating sound that seemed to mock the stillness of the afternoon. She hated those fences. They were a scar on the land, a declaration that something that was once open was now closed, forbidden, owned. Her silver hairpin, a small, elegant clasp her father had given her mother long ago, felt cool against her scalp. It was her only heirloom, a tangible piece of a time before the sickness, before the debt, before Silas Van Dorn. She touched it now, its smooth surface a small comfort, a reminder of a gentler love. It was a piece of her she would not let Van Dorn own. As she neared her home, a small, weathered clapboard house at the edge of town, she saw Luke Ramsey leaning against the corral fence. He had been waiting. He straightened up as she approached, pulling his hat from his head. His hair was the color of sun-bleached straw. "May," he said. His voice was low, and it always seemed to hold a question. "Luke." She stopped a few feet from him, her hands clasped in front of her. The air between them was filled with years of things unsaid. "Saw you at the auction," he began, then stopped. He looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands. "Tough-looking animals this season. The heat's been hard on them." "It's been hard on everyone," she said softly. He looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. He saw the weariness in her, the shadow that had settled there since winter. "I heard folks are talking." May's chin lifted. She was quiet, but she was not weak. "Let them talk. Talk is cheap." "It's not right," he said, his voice tight. "What Van Dorn is doing, fencing the range, choking the wells." "The well is life. Luke, he who owns the water owns it all." She looked past him, toward the brown hills. "My mother, she's not well." It was the closest she had come to admitting her burden to him. Luke took a step closer. He smelled of horse and leather and the clean scent of the open range. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, carefully folded piece of paper. It was a few dollars. His wages from the last roundup. "It's not much," he said, holding it out to her. "But maybe it helps. For the doctor." Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. It was the simple, honest kindness of the offer that undid her. He had so little, and he offered it freely. She shook her head, pushing his hand gently away. "I can't take your money. Luke, you have your own way to make." "My way is wherever the herds go," he said with a sad, crooked smile. "I follow the seasons. There's always another drive." He hesitated. "May, there's always another choice. You don't have to." He couldn't finish the sentence. He couldn't say Van Dorn's name. "Sometimes," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "there's only one choice left that keeps your family safe." The hope in his eyes flickered. He understood. He put the money back in his pocket and settled his hat on his head. The faded clay of his neckerchief seemed to hold all the dust and sorrow of the dying summer. "I'll be heading north in the morning, driving a herd up toward the Powder River. Be safe, Luke." "I always am." He touched the brim of his hat, a small, formal gesture that felt like a goodbye to more than just the day. He turned and walked away, his stride long and easy. The walk of a man at home in the saddle, but nowhere else. May watched him go until he was just a silhouette against the setting sun. He was a good man, a kind man. He represented a life of freedom, of shared work and simple peace, a life she could no longer afford. She went inside her home, the air cool and smelling of dried herbs and her mother's medicinal tea. She sat by her mother's bed, took her thin, frail hand, and looked at the face softened by sleep and illness. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a sacrifice. And as the last light faded from the sky, leaving the red buttes in purple shadow, May Carter knew she would pay the price. The freedom of the open range was for men like Luke Ramsey. For her, there was only the cold security of a cage and the rustle of whispers that sounded like the dry, dead grass of summer. The morning broke hot and white, bleaching the color from the sky. The final day of the horse auction began not with the sale of an animal, but with the sale of the land itself. Silas Van Dorn, with Sheriff Tolliver at his elbow, stood on the auctioneer's block. He did not shout. His voice was a low, carrying rumble that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. He held up a piece of paper, a deed thick with legal script and an official-looking seal. "By authority of the Territorial Land Office," Van Dorn announced, a faint smirk touching his lips. "The parcel known as Cottonwood Basin, including all surface and subterranean water rights, has been sold to the Van Dorn Cattle Company." A wave of disbelief, then anger, swept through the assembled homesteaders. The Cottonwood Well was the only free water for miles, a place where families had watered their small herds and filled their barrels for a generation. It was common land, or so everyone had believed. An old farmer named Abe Henderson, his face a roadmap of sun and worry, pushed his way to the front. "That's community land. Van Dorn, father dug that well with his own hands." Sheriff Tolliver stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "The paperwork is in order." Abe signed and sealed. "Mr. Van Dorn holds the title. Any man who draws water from that well without his permission is trespassing. That's the law." The paper was a lie, a piece of legal trickery cooked up in a distant office by a man who had likely been paid handsomely for his signature. But the sheriff's gun was real. The homesteaders looked from Van Dorn's cold, satisfied face to Tolliver's eager one, and they knew they were beaten. They were men with plows and families, not gunmen. Van Dorn had bought their water, their future, for the price of a bribe and a piece of stamped paper. The anger in the crowd curdled into a bitter, helpless silence. The auction continued, but the spirit had gone out of it. The clatter of hooves sounded like funeral drums. That evening, a fine, miserable drizzle began to fall. Not enough to settle the dust, but just enough to make the world gray and cold. The wedding was a rushed, somber affair in the small, stone chapel. The air inside was chilly and smelled of damp wool and dying flowers. May stood at the altar in a borrowed dress of pale gray silk. It was too large in the shoulders and felt like a costume for a play she had no wish to be in. Her face was pale and composed, a mask of calm she had carefully constructed. Beside her, her mother sat in the front pew, her small body racked with silent sobs that shook the worn wooden bench. Silas Van Dorn stood waiting, impassive and solid as a boulder. He was dressed in a fine black suit that made him look even larger. He watched May walk toward him with an expression of ownership, the same look he gave a prize bull he had just purchased. Reverend Hale stood before them, his Bible open, his voice droning on about duty, submission, and the sanctity of the union. But his words were hollow, lost in the oppressive silence of the chapel. Outside, hidden in the shadows of the blacksmith's forge across the street, Luke Ramsey watched the light from the chapel's windows. The drizzle collected on the brim of his hat and dripped onto his shoulders. The wind carried the smell of rain on hot dust and the sharp, metallic scent of coal smoke from the forge's dying embers. He saw the silhouettes move inside, saw May's slender form standing beside Van Dorn's bulk, and a cold, hard anger tightened in his chest. He had to say something, one last time. He slipped across the street, his boots making no sound on the damp earth. He moved to the side of the chapel, to the small vestry door that had been left ajar. He saw her through the crack. She was staring straight ahead, her eyes fixed on the stained glass window behind the altar, a depiction of a shepherd leading his flock that seemed like a cruel joke. As the Reverend paused to clear his throat, Luke risked a whisper, his voice a low vibration that was meant only for her. "May, you have another choice." Her head turned just a fraction of an inch. He saw the line of her jaw tighten. Her reply came back just as softly, a breath of sound laced with all the pain of her predicament. "Not when my mother needs medicine and Red Butte only has one lender." That was it, the truth, stark and simple as a gravestone. It was not a choice. It was a ransom. He saw her lift a hand to her hair, her fingers brushing against the silver pin he recognized as her mother's. It was a small, defiant gesture, as if she were anchoring herself to a memory of a better time. He knew then that he could do nothing more. To stay would be to invite a fight he could not win, one that would only bring more trouble down on her. Inside, Van Dorn was well aware of the transaction he was completing. His arrangement with the sheriff was simple. Tolliver would uphold his claim on the water, and in return, Van Dorn would continue to finance the sheriff's considerable gambling debts. The wedding was the final seal on the deal. Marrying May Carter, the one woman in town who had ever looked him in the eye and told him he was wrong, was a particular point of satisfaction. It was a way to tame her, to break that quiet stubbornness and demonstrate to everyone in Red Butte that he could own anything, or anyone, he wanted. As Reverend Hale pronounced them man and wife, May did not flinch. She felt Van Dorn's hand, heavy and proprietary, on her arm. She focused on the feeling of the silver pin in her hair, cool and solid against her skin. She made a silent vow to herself. He could have her name, her labor, her presence in his house, but he would not have her spirit. She would earn her keep, maintain her self-respect, through the work of her hands, not through obedience. She would not let her spine be broken by his fences or his wealth. Luke had already turned away from the chapel door. He walked back into the darkness, the sounds of the ceremony fading behind him. His course was set. He would leave that night, push the herd north to the Powder River, and lose himself in the vast, empty spaces where a man could breathe. But he had one last thing to do. He went to his horse, tied outside the livery, and retrieved a small cloth sack from his saddlebag. He walked to the edge of town, to the little house where May had lived her whole life. The lights were out. The place already looked lonely and abandoned. He knelt by the front door and gently pushed the sack into the space between the door and the threshold. Inside the sack were seeds, the hardy seeds of a drought-tolerant grass he had traded a silver dollar for last season. With them, he tucked a small, folded piece of paper. On it, he had written a few words in his careful, clumsy script. "If one day you are free, these seeds will grow." It was a prayer, a promise, a foolish act of faith. He did not know if she would ever find it, or if she would understand what it meant. But he had to leave a piece of hope behind. He stood, settled his hat firmly on his head, and walked back to his horse without looking back. The last peal of the church bell faded into the drizzly night. The sky overhead was the color of a fresh bruise, dark and heavy. In the Copper Spur Saloon, Silas Van Dorn stood at the bar, surrounded by Sheriff Tolliver and a few of his ranch hands. He raised a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light from the oil lamps. A slow, satisfied smile spread across his face as he looked out the window toward the silent chapel. "To my bride," he said, his voice thick with triumph. He took a long drink, then set the glass down hard on the bar. "And to the law of the land," he laughed, a short, harsh sound with no humor in it. "Freedom here is sold at auction." Life in Silas Van Dorn's house was a study in cold order. The ranch house was large and imposing, filled with heavy, dark furniture that seemed to absorb the light. May was given a room of her own at the end of a long hallway. Separate from his, it was a clean, quiet cell. Their marriage was a contract, and he respected its terms with a chilling formality. They took their meals together in a cavernous dining room, sitting at opposite ends of a long, polished table. The silence between them was broken only by the clink of silverware against porcelain. He spoke to her in commands, not conversation. The books are not balanced for the month. The men need more salt beef. See to it. She found her purpose not as a wife, but as an employee. She took over the ranch's ledgers, her neat handwriting filling the pages with a precision that straightened out years of his careless accounting. She managed the cookhouse, ensuring the cowboys were fed well and on time. She was good at the work. It was a form of self-preservation, a way to build a wall of competence around the part of herself that remained untouched. She earned her keep with her labor, and in that, she found a sliver of dignity. The town of Red Butte, however, saw only the surface of the arrangement. On Sundays, Reverend Hale stood at his pulpit and preached sermons on the virtue of order. He spoke of God's plan, a rigid hierarchy where every man and woman had their place. A wife's duty is to be a helpmeet to her husband, he declared, his eyes sweeping over the congregation, seeming to linger on May. To submit to his wisdom and authority is to find peace. After the service, the women of the church gathered in small groups, their voices a low buzz of gossip. May could feel their eyes on her as she helped her mother, who was looking a little stronger with the regular medicine, into their new buggy. She traded her name for a roof. One woman whispered to another behind her fan, "Some girls will do anything to escape poverty." They did not see the cage. They saw only that it was gilded. The words were meant to sting, and they did. But May held her head high. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Meanwhile, Van Dorn's ambition continued to stretch across the range like a shadow. New spools of barbed wire arrived on every train, and his men worked from sunup to sundown, stringing the metal thorns across miles of open country. The fences cut off old cattle trails and blocked homesteaders from traditional grazing lands. He set spring gun traps along the new fence lines, not to kill, but to maim and terrify. A farmer's dog was found with its legs shattered, a bloody warning to all who might consider cutting the wire. The strain on the cottonwood well began to show. Van Dorn's massive herds drank from it daily, and the water level dropped. Soon, the water that was drawn up came with a reddish tint and a metallic taste. It was the taste of rust, the taste of a resource being bled dry. The community's lifeblood was growing thin and sour. One morning, a message appeared on the town's public notice board, written in thick strokes of white chalk, "Water is for all." The words were a simple statement of a forgotten truth. By noon, Sheriff Tolliver had scraped them off, his face red with anger. He deputized a hulking, mean-spirited cowboy named Duke Moyer and sent him to find the culprit. Duke was a man who enjoyed his work. He dragged two young homesteaders out of the Copper Spur saloon and beat them in the street, claiming they looked like troublemakers. No one dared to intervene. It was another message, delivered with fists instead of chalk. In this tightening world, May found allies in unexpected corners. Rosa Delgado, the stout, no-nonsense woman who ran the ranch's kitchen, became a silent Confederate. She would pass May a hot cup of coffee in the morning with a look that spoke volumes. "He is a man who thinks he can buy the sun," she'd mutter, stirring a massive pot of stew. "But the sun still burns who it pleases." Jonas Pike, the town's blacksmith, offered his help in his own quiet way. He was a freedman who had come west to build a new life, a powerful man whose skill with a hammer and anvil was unmatched. When May brought a broken harness to him, he would mend it with extra care, refusing payment. "Some debts are not paid with coin. Mrs. Van Dorn," he would say, his eyes kind. He saw her not as Van Dorn's property, but as May Carter. And there was Dr. Merriweather, the old doctor, his hands gnarled with arthritis but his mind still sharp, would deliver the medicine for May's mother personally. He would sit with the old woman for a few minutes, then speak with May in low tones on the porch. He brought her news from the homesteads, stories of hardship and defiance. He can fence the land. May, the doctor advised, his voice a dry rasp. But do not let him fence your spirit. Do not let your soul dry up like the august grass. News of the world beyond Red Butte, and news of Luke, arrived in trickles. A cowboy drifting through town after a long drive might mention seeing him up in the Bighorn country, working for a different outfit. He was earning a reputation as a top hand, a man you could count on when things got rough. He was saving his money. They said, then, one afternoon, Rosa discreetly passed May a postcard. It had been sent to the general delivery at the Mercantile, addressed to Rosa. On one side was a rough, hand-drawn sketch of a green cypress tree, standing alone on a hill. On the other, a few lines in a familiar script. I am still waiting for the right season's rain. May held the postcard in her hands, the worn cardboard a connection to a life that felt a world away. He had not forgotten. The simple drawing of the tree, a symbol of endurance, was a message of hope more powerful than 1,000 words. She tucked the card away in the same tin box where she kept her mother's silver pin, a small treasure of a life she still held inside her. The weather, as if in league with the growing tension, turned mean. The sky turned a sickly yellow-brown, and the wind began to howl, picking up the dry topsoil and flinging it across the plains. A dust storm, a rolling, choking cloud of grit, descended on Red Butte. It blotted out the sun, turning midday into a suffocating twilight. At the ranch, the storm created chaos. The cattle, blinded and terrified, drifted with the wind, bellowing in distress. A herd of newborn calves, separated from their mothers, was in danger of being lost or trampled. Van Dorn was in town, meeting with a man from the railroad. His foreman was panicking, shouting orders that no one could hear over the roar of the wind. May saw the disaster unfolding. Without a moment's hesitation, she pulled a bandana over her nose and mouth, put on a thick coat, and went out into the storm. She went straight to the cowboys, who were huddled near the bunkhouse. "Get ropes," she yelled, her voice cutting through the gale. "We'll make a drift fence, a human one. We need to turn them back toward the sheltered coulee." The men looked at her, then at the foreman, then back at her. They had seen her work the books, run the kitchen. They respected her for it. But this was something different. This was a rancher's work, seeing the decisiveness in her eyes, the clear, calm command in her voice. They moved. They grabbed their ropes, mounted their smartest horses, and followed her into the brown maelstrom. For hours, they fought the storm. May rode alongside them, her small frame bent against the wind, her voice directing the effort. She knew horses, and she knew cattle. She understood their fear, knew how to turn the led animals and let the others follow. Slowly, painstakingly, they managed to push the terrified calves into the relative safety of a deep, brush-filled ravine, where they would be sheltered from the worst of the wind. When the storm finally blew itself out late that night, not a single calf had been lost. The cowboys looked at her with a new kind of respect. She had not just given orders, she had worked alongside them, taking the same risks, breathing the same dust. She had saved a valuable part of the herd with her quick thinking and courage. When Van Dorn returned, he heard the story from his foreman. He saw the way his men looked at his wife, and he did not like it. He had married her to own her, to display her as another of his possessions. He had not married her to be his equal, or to earn the admiration of his employees. Her competence was a challenge to his absolute authority. Her strength was a rebellion. A few days later, he confronted her in his office. He sat behind his massive desk, a ledger open before him. "The bill from Dr. Merriweather is higher this month," he said, his voice flat and cold. "My mother's cough has returned. She requires more medicine. Medicine is expensive." He tapped a finger on the page. "This ranch must be profitable. Every expense must be justified." He looked up at her, his eyes like chips of ice. "I find this particular expense excessive." May stared at him, her heart turning to a cold, heavy stone. You gave your word. You said you would care for her. I am a generous man, he said, but my generosity has its limits. He pushed another document across the desk toward her. It was a deed. Your family owns a small burial plot at the edge of town, an unproductive piece of land. Sign it over to me. A gesture of goodwill. Then we can continue to discuss the matter of your mother's medicine. She looked at the paper, then back at his face. The burial plot was where her father was buried. It was the last piece of the world that belonged to the Carter family. He was not just asking for land. He was asking for her heritage, for her past. He was trying to erase her, to make her entirely his. He was tightening the leash, turning the screw, teaching her, as he had once said, a lesson in submission. May stood there, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The wind had been a test of nature. This was a test of the soul. She looked at the man she had married, a man who would barter a woman's life for a piece of dirt. And she knew the true storm was not the one that carried the dust. It was the one that was about to break inside this house. In the quiet hours after midnight, when the wind sighed through the dry grass, the wild horses came. They were a ghostly herd, moving like smoke in the moonlight. But their leader was a solid, powerful creature. He was a gray stallion, and across his left eye ran a streak of pure white, a jagged mark like a lightning strike frozen on his hide. May took to watching for him from her window. He was a symbol of everything she was not untamed, unbound, utterly free. Night after night, the stallion would lead his band to the new barbed wire fence at the base of Cottonwood Hill. He would not challenge it, but would pace its length, his head high, testing the air, as if searching for a way through to something he remembered. May watched him, a kinship forming in her heart with the wild animal. He was looking for a path, a memory of water. The thought took root. She knew the land, had walked every inch of it as a girl. There were no streams on this side of the hill, but the stallion was persistent, his instinct a force of nature. One afternoon, driven by a curiosity that felt more like a calling, she saddled a mare and rode out, telling no one where she was going. She followed the fence line, her eyes on the ground, searching for the stallion's tracks. She found them near a thicket of overgrown greasewood, a place where the earth slumped into a shallow depression. The tracks were heavy here, where the herd had milled about in frustration. Pushing through the thorny brush, she found what they were looking for. Hidden behind a curtain of old, gnarled roots was a shadow in the hillside, an opening that was not a cave. It was the collapsed entrance to a tunnel, its mouth choked with a jumble of fallen rock and earth. A few of the rocks were blackened, shattered with a sharp, unnatural violence that spoke not of time, but of dynamite. As she knelt, pressing her ear to a large, flat slab of limestone, she could feel a faint, deep vibration, a thrum of immense pressure from within the earth. It was water, a whole river of it, trapped and silenced. The truth struck her with the force of a physical blow. This was no natural collapse. Van Dorn had found this old, natural aqueduct, this secret artery of the hills, and had sealed it. He had blown the entrance shut to cut off the land's own supply, forcing everything, man and beast, to depend on the single well he now owned. His greed had not just fenced the land, it had damned its very heart. That evening, her mind racing, she sought out her allies. She found Jonas Pike at his forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer on steel a steady, honest sound in the growing dusk. She spoke in a low voice, her words tumbling out, describing the blocked tunnel, the scorch marks, the feeling of the water waiting on the other side. Jonas listened without interruption, his dark face thoughtful in the glowing light of the forge. He wiped his hands on a leather apron and looked at her, his gaze direct. A lie of that size, he said softly, must be answered with a truth of equal force. Later, in the heat and steam of the ranch kitchen, she told Rosa. The cook placed a heavy cleaver down on the butcher block with a thud. "I knew it," she hissed, her eyes flashing. "I knew he was a snake, but I did not know he was the kind that could swallow a river." Their conspiracy was born in whispers. The plan was simple and perilous. They would work at night, with crowbars and leverage, to pry open a small fissure in the rockfall, just enough to let a trickle of water escape, enough to prove what lay hidden. It was a risk. If they were caught, Van Dorn's wrath and the sheriff's law would be swift and brutal. Their first night was one of tense, back-breaking labor. Jonas's strength was immense, the muscles in his arms cording as he worked a long iron bar into the cracks between the stones. May, smaller but agile, cleared away the smaller debris, her hands growing raw and scraped. Rosa stood watch at the edge of the thicket, a dark, silent sentinel, ready to give a warning whistle at the slightest sound. They worked by the dim, shielded light of a single lantern, the scrape of iron on rock seeming impossibly loud in the vast silence of the prairie night. May had also spoken to Dr. Merriweather, trusting his discretion. The old doctor's eyes had lit up with a scientific fire. Limestone formations are full of such channels, he'd explained. To prove the source, you need to measure the flow. Take a length of candle wick. May, time how long it takes to become saturated when you hold it in the stream. A consistent flow, day after day, proves it is a spring, not just runoff. He gave her a small, brass pocket watch, its tick a quiet measure of their dangerous progress. The pressure on them mounted daily. Duke Moyer, Van Dorn's brutish enforcer, seemed to be everywhere, his suspicious eyes lingering on Jonas's forge, on the ranch kitchen, on May herself. He would appear silently, his spurs jingling, and ask pointed questions. Saw a light up on Cottonwood Hill the other night. He drawled, watching May's face for a reaction. Must be ghosts. Reverend Hale, too, seemed to sense the shift in the town's undercurrent. His sermons took on a new fire, railing against the sin of envy and the saboteurs of God's given order. He spoke of the sanctity of private property, his gaze sweeping the pews, making honest people feel like criminals for their thirst. In response, Sheriff Tolliver formed a night patrol, a handful of Van Dorn's men who rode the range with rifles across their saddles, their purpose less about law and more about intimidation. At home, the Cold War with her husband escalated. May's mother took a turn for the worse, her breathing becoming shallow, her cough returning with a frightening persistence. When May asked Van Dorn for the money for the medicine, he simply looked at her, his face a mask of indifference. "I am still considering the matter of the family plot," he said. The medicine did not come. 2 days later, he repeated the phrase. It was a deliberate, calculated cruelty, a tightening of the screw. He was starving her of hope, using her mother's life as a tool. "This is a lesson in obedience," he told her one evening, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You will learn it." It was into this suffocating atmosphere that Luke Ramsey returned. He was not alone. He was the trail boss for a herd of 1,000 longhorns, pushing them through to a northern railhead. They were a river of hide and horn, flowing past the outskirts of Red Butte, raising a cloud of dust that could be seen for miles. That evening, Luke and a few of his drovers went into the Copper Spur Saloon for a quiet drink. The place was crowded and noisy. At a corner table, Duke Moyer and 2 of Van Dorn's men were drinking heavily. Rosa was there, having just delivered a crate of supplies from the ranch. As she turned to leave, Duke grabbed her arm. "Where you hurrying off to?" "Rosa," he slurred, a foul grin on his face. "Stay and have a drink with a real man." Rosa tried to pull her arm away. "I have work to do. Let me go." "Not till you smile for me," Duke insisted, his grip tightening. Before anyone else could move, Luke was there. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed his hand on Duke's shoulder, his grip like iron. "The lady said she has work to do," Luke said, his voice low and steady. Duke turned, his eyes blurry with drink and surprise. He saw the cold calm in Luke's face and, for a moment, the drunken bravado left him, but his pride and the eyes of his friends made him reckless. He shoved Luke, trying to throw him off balance. "This ain't your affair, drifter," Duke snarled. Luke did not move back an inch. His hands shot out, not in a punch, but in an open-palmed strike that caught Duke squarely in the chest. It was a move of shocking speed and force, and it sent the bigger man stumbling backward over a chair, crashing to the floor in a heap. The saloon went silent. Duke's friends started to rise, but stopped when they saw the look in Luke's eyes. It was not anger. It was a flat, deadly warning. Luke looked down at the sprawling Moyer. "Let's not have this be your affair either," he said. He then turned to Rosa. "Are you all right?" She nodded, shaken but unharmed. Luke escorted her to the door and watched until she was safely on her way. He turned back to the bar, paid for his men's drinks, and they left. The confrontation had taken less than a minute, but a line had been drawn. Later that night, a soft rain began to fall, tapping gently on the roof of the stables. May had gone there to check on a sick mare. The familiar smells of hay and horse a comfort to her frayed nerves. A figure appeared in the wide doorway, silhouetted against the gray, rainy night. It was Luke. He took off his hat, his hair damp from the rain. They stood in silence for a long moment. The only sounds the soft rain and the gentle shifting of the horses in their stalls. There were no words for the chasm that lay between them, for the life that had been stolen. "I heard about what happened at the saloon," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for helping, Rosa, but you shouldn't have. It's dangerous for you here." She looked at him, her heart aching. "Don't stay. Luke, please, don't stay if it will get you killed." He took a step closer, into the warm lantern light. His face was leaner than she remembered, carved by the sun and the long miles. "I am just passing through," he said softly. He looked at her, his gaze taking in the shadows under her eyes, the tired set of her shoulders. "I'm sorry, May, for all of it. It's not your sorrow to carry. Some things a man carries anyway." He stopped a few feet from her. He wanted to reach out, to pull her into his arms, to tell her to come with him, to leave this all behind. But he knew he could not. She was Van Dorn's wife. He had no right, so he just stood there, his hands clenched at his sides. "I heard about your mother," he said. "If you need anything." "There is nothing anyone can do," she cut in, her voice brittle. Their hands brushed as she turned to pick up a lantern, a fleeting contact of calloused skin that sent a jolt through both of them. It was a touch that held more intimacy than 1,000 polite conversations. "I heard you were waiting," she said, looking down at their hands, which had now fallen away. "Rosa showed me your postcard." "I am," he said. "I wait for the right season's rain." A small, sad smile touched her lips. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, cloth sack, worn soft from handling. It was the packet of seeds. She held it out on the palm of her hand. "I still have them," she said. "I haven't planted them." He looked at the seeds, then back at her face, seeing the new, fierce determination in her eyes. "When the water is free," she said, her voice gaining a strength that startled him, "the seeds will grow." In that moment, he understood. Her fight was not just about survival anymore. It was about reclamation. His small, personal gift of hope had become entwined with a much larger struggle. He nodded slowly, a deep respect dawning in his eyes. The rain was falling harder now, a steady, cleansing sound on the roof. It was not yet the rain they were waiting for, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like it might be coming. Silas Van Dorn moved his war from the range to the courtroom. He sent for lawyers from Cheyenne, men in city suits who arrived on the train and looked at the dusty streets of Red Butte with disdain. They spent their days in his office, drafting documents filled with legal language that twisted the truth into a weapon. A lawsuit was being prepared, a sweeping complaint against a dozen homesteaders for trespassing, water theft, and damage to property. The centerpiece of his strategy, however, was a man named Judge Hargrove, a circuit judge with a fondness for expensive cigars and a weakness for speculative ventures. Van Dorn hosted the judge for dinner, a quiet affair with thick steaks and older whiskey, over brandy. He spoke not of the law, but of the future. He spoke of the railroad's expansion, of the immense profits to be made, and of a unique opportunity to acquire a block of shares at a founder's price. The judge, a man who understood the nuances of power, listened intently. By the time he left, his name was on a list of investors, and Van Dorn was assured that the law, when it arrived in Red Butte, would be on his side. The moral attack came, as always, from the pulpit. The following Sunday, Reverend Hale seemed to draw strength from the oppressive heat that filled the chapel. He stood before his congregation, his face flushed, and delivered a sermon on the wickedness of rebellion. He did not use names, but every eye knew who he was speaking of. He quoted passages about servants obeying their masters and wives submitting to their husbands. He painted a picture of a righteous community built on order and respect for property, and of the dark forces of chaos and envy that sought to tear it down. "There are those among us," he thundered, his voice echoing in the rafters, "who mistake their own stubborn pride for the will of God. They seek to sow discord and dismantle the foundations of our town for their own selfish ends. They are the serpent in our garden, whispering lies against the rightful order of things." May sat beside her mother, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She felt the weight of the stairs, the heat of the judgment. Some of the women who had once greeted her with a nod now looked away, their faces set in grim disapproval. They saw her as a disgrace, a woman who did not know her place. But after the service, as she walked home, she saw a different kind of message. A small, round loaf of freshly baked sourdough bread sat on her porch step, still warm, wrapped in a clean dishcloth. There was no note. The next day, a small pail of fresh milk appeared in the same spot. They were silent gestures of support from women who were too afraid to speak out, but who would not let her stand entirely alone. The town was drawing a line, and people were choosing their sides in whispers and in bread. The confrontation with her husband was inevitable. She found him in his office. The railroad contract spread across his desk like a map of his kingdom. She stood before him, her presence a quiet challenge. "The medicine for my mother has not arrived," she said, her voice even. "I am still weighing the expense," he replied, not looking up from his papers. "You are weighing her life against a deed to a graveyard. There is no scale that can balance those two things." He finally raised his head, his eyes cold. "Everything has a price. You, of all people, should understand that." A spark of defiance, hot and pure, flared within her. "You can buy the land, and you can buy the water, but you cannot buy the rain. Mr. Van Dorn, you cannot own the sky." A slow, unpleasant smile touched his lips. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "You are wrong, my dear," he said, his voice a low, confident purr. "I can buy the weather. I do it with the law. The law is a far more reliable force than the clouds." That night, the sky itself seemed to rise to the challenge. The air grew thick and heavy, and a strange, greenish light fell over the plains. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that grew steadily into a roar. The storm broke with a primal fury. Rain came down in blinding sheets, and lightning spider-webbed across the sky, turning the night to a series of stark, flashing tableaus. A bolt of lightning, brighter and louder than the rest, struck with a deafening crack. It hit the roof of the main hay barn. For a moment, there was silence, and then a faint, orange glow appeared in the darkness. Within seconds, the glow became a raging inferno. The dry hay, cured by the long summer, went up like gunpowder. Panic erupted. Cowboys ran from the bunkhouse, shouting uselessly into the wind and rain. The herd, penned in the corral next to the burning barn, began to stampede in terror, their bellows of fear a terrible sound. They were in danger of being roasted alive or trampling each other to death against the fences. Van Dorn was gone. Having ridden to a neighboring ranch before the storm hit, his foreman stood frozen, paralyzed by the scale of the disaster. May did not hesitate. She ran from the house, the wind tearing at her dress. She saw the madness in the corral, the way the animals were pressing against the downwind fence, their eyes rolling in terror as the heat washed over them. She knew they had to be released, but if they were simply let out, they would scatter for miles across the open range. She found the foreman. "Open the far gates," she screamed over the roar of the fire. "The ones on the north side." What he yelled back, confused, "They'll run off. They'll run into the wind. It's their instinct. It will lead them away from the fire, not toward it. Do it now." Her certainty cut through his panic. He relayed the order. As Cowboy scrambled to open the gates on the far side of the corral, May grabbed a slicker and a rope and vaulted onto the back of her mare, riding bareback into the chaos. The heat from the fire was a physical blow, and the air was thick with smoke and embers. She rode along the fence line, her voice a high, piercing cry, turning the led steers, pushing them away from the fire and toward the open gate. Just as the herd began to turn, a figure on horseback appeared out of the rainy darkness. It was Luke. He must have seen the fire from his camp. He needed no orders. He saw what she was doing and immediately fell in beside her, his rope a living thing in his hands, guiding the panicked animals. Together, they worked as a single entity, their movements synchronized, their shared knowledge of horses and cattle a silent language between them. They were a small island of purpose in a sea of chaos. As the last of the herd streamed through the gate and out into the relative safety of the open pasture, a section of the barn's burning roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame. A heavy, smoldering beam crashed to the ground near May. Luke's horse reared, and he spurred it forward, pushing her and her mare out of the way just as the timber fell. A piece of it struck his forearm, and he cried out, a sharp intake of breath. They brought the fire under control hours later, when the worst of the storm had passed and the relentless rain finally helped them subdue the flames. The barn was a smoking, blackened skeleton, but the herd was safe. In the quiet aftermath, May found Luke in the stables, leaning against a stall, his face pale in the lantern light. She carried a bucket of clean water and a roll of linen bandages. "Let me see," she said softly. He held out his arm. A nasty burn ran from his wrist to his elbow, the skin red and blistered. She said nothing, simply dipped a cloth in the cool water and began to clean the wound with a touch that was gentle and sure. He winced, but did not pull away. They stood in the warm, quiet dark of the stables, the air filled with the scent of rain-soaked earth and horses. The only sound was the steady drip of water from the eaves. She wrapped his arm carefully, her fingers brushing against his skin. When she was finished, they did not move apart. The exhaustion of the night settled over them, a heavy blanket. She leaned her shoulder against his, and he did not stiffen. He relaxed into the touch, letting his head rest for a moment against hers. It was not the touch of a lover, but something deeper, the shared solace of two people who understood each other without the need for words. A quiet peace settled between them, a stillness that the world outside could not penetrate. In that moment of shared silence, May felt a clarity so profound it was like a physical sensation. Being near Luke, even in the midst of disaster, was a feeling of rightness, of partnership. It was the quiet peace of shared labor. Being with Van Dorn was a constant battle, a trench dug between two enemies. One was a home, the other was a war. The next morning, the town was alive with the story of the fire and of her courage. The cowboys spoke of her with open admiration. Van Dorn returned to find his barn destroyed, but his herd saved, and the credit for it laid squarely at his wife's feet. His face was a thundercloud. Her heroism was another act of defiance, another claim to an identity that was not his to give. He acted swiftly. That afternoon, Sheriff Tolliver, with Duke Moyer and two other deputies, rode up to the blacksmith's shop. They found Jonas Pike shaping a horseshoe, the muscles in his back and arms moving with powerful grace. The sheriff unrolled a warrant. "Jonas Pike," he said, his voice loud for the benefit of the gathering onlookers. "You are under arrest." Jonas slowly lowered his hammer. On what charge? Destruction of property, malicious mischief, a whole list of things. Tolliver's eyes flickered toward the Van Dorn ranch house, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He knew May would be watching. They put Jonas in irons. He did not resist. He held his head high, his gaze meeting May's across the distance. It was a message. Van Dorn could not break him, either. May watched them lead her friend away. The bravest, most decent man she knew, treated like a common criminal. She knew, with chilling certainty, that this was not about Jonas. It was about her. It was a move to isolate her, to frighten her, to force her to confess to a crime she did not commit just to save her friend. Van Dorn had taken a hostage. She went to her room and stood by the window. Looking out at the brown hills, she thought of her mother, frail and sick. She thought of Jonas, sitting in a dark, dusty cell. She thought of Luke, his arm bandaged, riding north and away from this poisoned town. And she thought of the water, trapped and silent in the heart of the earth. Van Dorn was wrong. The law was not the weather. The law could be broken, but water, like truth, always sought its own level. A choice had been forced upon her. She could retreat into silence and let her friend pay the price for her courage, or she could stand and fight. She took a deep breath. She would not let Jonas rot in a cell. She would tell them all what she knew. She would tell them about the tunnel. She would face Van Dorn in the open, in front of the whole town. The town of Red Butte did not have a proper courthouse, so justice was dispensed in the granary. The large, barn-like structure was cleared of wagons and sacks, and rough wooden benches were arranged in rows. The air inside was thick and hot, smelling of old grain, leather, and the nervous sweat of the men and women packed shoulder to shoulder. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the gloom through gaps in the walls. At the front, Judge Hargrove sat behind a makeshift bench made of stacked crates, looking impatient and out of place in his fine wool suit. Silas Van Dorn stood beside his lawyer, a portrait of smug confidence. He presented his case first, the lawyer, in a smooth, condescending tone, laid out the legal documents, the official deed from the Territorial Land Office, stamped and sealed, granting Van Dorn exclusive rights to the Cottonwood Basin and all its water. He spoke of private property as a sacred right, the very foundation of civilization. He painted the homesteaders as thieves and vandals, envious of Mr. Van Dorn's success. It was a cold, effective presentation, backed by the full weight of paper and ink. When it was her turn, May walked to the front alone. She carried no legal papers. In one hand, she held a large piece of tanned leather on which she had painstakingly drawn a map of the limestone strata under Cottonwood Hill, just as Dr. Merriweather had described it. In her other hand, she held a clear glass jar filled with water. It was the water from the fissure she and Jonas had opened, and it was clean and free of the rust that now tainted the well. She placed the map in the jar on the judge's bench. "This is a map of the land's own veins," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying to the back of the granary. "And this," she held up the jar, "the water catching the light, is its blood. It does not belong to one man, it belongs to the earth." Van Dorn's lawyer scoffed. "Your Honor, we are here to discuss law, not poetry. This is irrelevant." "Is it?" a new voice asked. Dr. Merriweather stepped forward, his old bones moving with a surprising agility. "That map is a fair representation of the geology of this area. The Cottonwood Spring System is a natural aquifer, a subterranean river. To block its main outlet is to starve the entire basin. It is an act of geological vandalism." Before the lawyer could object again, Rosa Delgado pushed her way through the crowd. She stood before the judge, her hands on her hips, her dark eyes flashing with anger. "And I am here to talk about threats," she said, pointing a finger at Duke Moyer, who stood near the door with the sheriff. "That man threatened me." He and the sheriff have been intimidating anyone who speaks out against Mr. Van Dorn. This is not about law. It is about fear. An old homesteader named Jedediah Smith, a man whose family had been in the territory for 50 years, stood up from his bench, his voice raspy with age. My father watered his stock from the overflow of that tunnel when this town was nothing but a tent. It was always for everyone. It was that way. Until he came. He nodded his head toward Van Dorn. The mood in the granary was shifting. The homesteaders, who had come in feeling beaten, were now murmuring their agreement. The looks they cast at Van Dorn were no longer just resentful. They were openly hostile. Judge Hargrove, seeing the proceedings slipping out of his control, banged a gavel on the crate. That is enough. Mrs. Van Dorn, do you have anything further to add? May took a deep breath. She looked at the faces in the crowd, at her mother's worried expression, at Jonas, who stood between two deputies, his face a mask of quiet dignity. She looked at Silas Van Dorn, at his cold, possessive stare, and she thought of Luke and the feeling of freedom that came just from knowing he existed in the world. Her voice, when she spoke, was thick with an emotion she could no longer contain. "I wish to tell you a story," she began, her gaze sweeping over the silent room. "It is the story of a woman in a town like this. In a time of drought, this woman was forced into a loveless marriage." She paused, and the silence in the room became absolute. A held breath. She found freedom in the cowboy who waited patiently for years. The words hung in the hot, dusty air. It was her own story, her own soul laid bare. Yet she had spoken it as a fable, a tale that belonged to everyone. Every woman in that room understood the cage of necessity. Every man understood the ache of a long wait, for a single, stunning moment. She was not Van Dorn's wife. She was the hero of a sad, familiar song. The room was so quiet you could hear the buzz of a fly near the rafters. Van Dorn's face was a mask of fury. He had been publicly shamed, his power questioned not with law, but with truth. He shot a look at Sheriff Tolliver, a look of pure command. The sheriff, jolted into action, suddenly pushed his way to the front. He held up a small, oily canvas packet. "Your Honor, while this hearing was going on, my deputies conducted a search of the blacksmith's property as part of the investigation into the destruction of Mr. Van Dorn's property." He opened the packet dramatically, revealing a half-dozen brass blasting caps and a length of fuse. "We found these hidden under a loose floorboard in his workshop." A gasp went through the crowd. Jonas Pike's eyes widened, not in guilt, but in disbelief. "Those are not mine," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That's what they all say," the sheriff sneered. "Blasting caps, the kind used to blow open a rock tunnel. Maybe, Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, I request that the prisoner be held without bail pending a full investigation." The spell was broken. The truth May had so carefully built was shattered by a crude, effective lie. Judge Hargrove, seeing his chance to regain control and please his benefactor, banged the gavel again. "This hearing is postponed until all evidence can be properly examined. The prisoner will be remanded to custody." The deputies grabbed Jonas's arms. He did not struggle. He looked once at May, a look of profound sorrow, not for himself, but for her. Then they led him away. The crowd began to file out into the harsh afternoon sun, confused and angry. Van Dorn stood beside his lawyer, his composure restored, a faint smile of victory on his lips. Outside, in the dusty street, Duke Moyer, emboldened by the turn of events, saw Luke Ramsey leaning against a watering trough. Luke had been there the whole time, listening from the doorway, his face grim. "What are you looking at?" Drifter Duke snarled. Walking up to him, he was spoiling for the fight he had been denied in the saloon. He shoved Luke's shoulder. "Lost your nerve." Luke slowly straightened up. The urge to hit the man, to release the rage and frustration that was boiling inside him, was a physical force. He could see the fight in his mind, a few hard, satisfying punches, and Duke Moyer would be spitting dust and teeth. But he saw the townspeople watching, their faces already filled with enough despair for one day. He saw May standing on the granary steps, her expression bleak. A street brawl would solve nothing. It would only confirm what the Reverend said about chaos and disorder. He looked Duke squarely in the eye, his own face calm and hard as granite. "Justice is one with a cool head. Moyer," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight. "You should try getting one sometime." He turned his back on the fuming Moyer and walked over to May. The crowd parted to let him pass. He stopped in front of her, the space between them charged with everything that had just happened. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small cloth sack of seeds. She pressed it into his hand. His fingers closed around hers for a brief, warm moment. "Keep this for me," she said, her voice low so only he could hear. "Keep it safe until the ground is wet enough to plant." It was an act of profound trust, a transfer of their shared, fragile hope. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He slipped the small sack into his shirt pocket, where it rested against his heart. As they stood there, a sudden coolness touched the air. The sky, which had been a merciless, brassy dome all day, had darkened. A single, fat drop of rain hit the dust at May's feet. Then another, and another. A sudden, brief downpour began. A cloudburst that lasted only a few minutes. It was not enough to break the drought, but it was enough to turn the dust dark, to release the rich, clean smell of lightning and wet earth into the air. The water ran in rivulets down the street and collected on the brim of Luke's hat, where the droplets clung like small, glittering beads of hope. The rain stopped as quickly as it had begun. The sun came out again, steaming the ground, inside the granary. Silas Van Dorn watched them through the open doors. He saw the way they looked at each other, saw the small exchange, saw the sudden rain. His face was a mask of cold rage. He had won the battle in the courtroom, but he had seen something far more dangerous today. A community beginning to find its courage. He would not let it grow. He turned to one of his hired men. "Ride to Cheyenne," he said, his voice a low growl. "Tell them I need 4 more men. Men who are good with guns and not afraid to use them." He looked back out at the hills. "I'm going to seal that tunnel for good. I'm going to bury it so deep no one will ever find it again." The nights that followed the hearing were no longer silent. Van Dorn's hired men from Cheyenne had arrived. Hard-faced men who did not speak much and whose eyes were always moving. They patrolled the town's edges. A constant, armed presence. The threat was no longer implied. One night, a volley of gunshots shattered the darkness. The bullets were not aimed to kill. They were a message. One tore through the window of the room where May's mother slept, showering the floor with glittering shards of glass. The shock sent the old woman into a violent, racking fit of coughing. And when May rushed to her side with a lamp, she saw the terrifying crimson stain on the handkerchief her mother held to her lips. The sight of the blood was like a knife to May's heart. The choice, which had been a matter of principle, was now a matter of life and death, laid bare in the flickering lamplight. Van Dorn had her cornered. She knew if she went to him, if she signed the deed to the burial plot, if she humbled herself and begged, the medicine would come. She could buy her mother a few more weeks, a few more months of shallow breaths, but the price was Jonas, abandoned in his cell. It was the community, left to thirst. It was her own soul, traded for a bottle of laudanum. She sat by her mother's bed all night, wiping her brow, whispering soothing words. She watched the labored rise and fall of her mother's chest and wrestled with the devil on her shoulder. To save a life you love, is any price too high? The question echoed in the silent room, but as dawn painted the broken window with pale, gray light, she found her answer. Her mother had lived a life of quiet dignity. To trade that legacy now for a few more days of suffering at the hands of a tyrant was not an act of love. It was a desecration. She looked at her own reflection in the remaining shards of the window pane. her face pale and determined. She would not sell her soul for medicine. Her decision galvanized the small band of allies. They could not wait for the law, which was bought and paid for. They could not wait for justice, which had been locked in a cell with Jonas. They had to act. That evening, Luke, Rosa, Dr. Merriweather, and 3 of the staunchest homesteaders met in the back room of the doctor's office. The plan was no longer to prove the water existed, but to set it free. They would go to the tunnel that night, under the light of the full moon, and they would not just open a fissure, they would open the floodgates. They had tools, long iron pry bars from the homesteads, thick ropes, and a block and tackle system that Jonas had once designed for lifting wagon engines. But their greatest obstacle was time. The sheriff's new patrols were vigilant. They ride the perimeter every 2 hours, Luke said, tracing a line on May's leather map. That doesn't give us much of a window. It was Dr. Merriweather who provided the solution. I paid a visit to our friend Jonas today, he said, a sly twinkle in his eye. The deputy on duty tonight is a young man named Miller, a good lad. Last spring, his horse threw a shoe miles from town. Jonas walked out, reshod the animal, and refused to take a penny for it. Said the boy would need the money for his family. The doctor paused, letting the story settle. I reminded young Miller of that today. I suggested that a man like Jonas deserved a bit of peace and quiet. He told me he often gets a powerful urge to inspect the cells on the far side of the jailhouse around midnight, an inspection that might take him a good, long while. Their window of time had been bought with an act of kindness. The moon was high and bright, casting the hills in stark silver and black. The work was brutal and dangerous. Under Luke's direction, they rigged the block and tackle to a thick, ancient cottonwood tree, anchoring it deep. They looped heavy ropes around the largest of the boulders that blocked the tunnel's mouth. Then, with the homesteaders and Luke pulling on the main line, the immense pressure of the pulley system began to work against the dead weight of the rock. The progress was agonizingly slow. The ropes groaned, stretched taut as banjo strings. The wood of the pulley block creaked in protest. May worked beside them, clearing smaller rocks, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands bleeding. The air grew thick with the smell of crushed stone and raw earth. From deep within the tunnel, they could hear a low, resonant groaning, the sound of a sleeping giant beginning to stir. The pressure of the water on the other side was immense. A large slab of limestone, a keystone in the blockage, began to shift. A shower of smaller rocks tumbled down. May, working too close to the edge, lost her footing and cried out as she slipped. In a heartbeat, Luke was there. He grabbed a spare rope and, with deft, sure hands, tied it securely around her waist, anchoring the other end to the cottonwood. He stood close to her, his hands briefly on her waist as he checked the knot. "This thing could go all at once," he said, his voice low and urgent, his face inches from hers. "If the water takes you, it has to take me too." The world seemed to fall away. There was only the roar of their own blood in their ears, the silver moonlight on his face, the absolute certainty in his eyes. The chaos of splintering rock and straining ropes faded into a distant hum. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. Their first kiss was not soft or gentle. It was desperate and immediate. A collision of two souls who had waited a lifetime for this moment. It was short, trembling, and tasted of salt, sweat, and the fine, gritty dust that coated their lips. It was not about romance. It was about the frantic, powerful beat of two hearts in unison. The shared breath in the face of danger. It was a kiss like a betrothal seal, a promise made in the heart of a storm. With a final, terrible groan, the keystone gave way. The blockage collapsed inward, and the water, held captive for years, burst forth. It did not trickle. It exploded out of the hillside in a solid, churning wave of white water. It roared into the dry creek bed, a sound of triumphant liberation, a song the land had forgotten how to sing. A wild, ragged cheer went up from the homesteaders as they watched the torrent pour out onto the thirsty plain, spreading out in a silver sheet under the moonlight. The cheer was answered by the sharp crack of a rifle. A bullet whined past Luke's head, smacking into the cottonwood tree. From the ridge above them, Duke Moyer and 4 of the new hired guns appeared, their rifles raised. They had been waiting. The deputy's distraction had not been enough.
"Looks like we found our vandals,"
Duke shouted, a vicious grin on his face. Another shot rang out. Dr. Merriweather, who had been standing near the creek bed, cried out and staggered back, clutching his shoulder. A dark stain began to spread across his shirt. Chaos erupted. Luke shoved May behind the relative safety of the cottonwood trunk, drawing his own pistol. The homesteaders, armed only with their tools, scrambled for cover. The night, which moments before had been filled with the joy of freedom, was now filled with the flash of gunfire and the deadly hum of lead. The news of the open tunnel and the wounded doctor reached Van Dorn before sunrise. He did not need to fabricate a crime now. One had been delivered to him. He rode into town at first light, his face a mask of cold fury and righteous indignation. He went straight to Judge Hargrove's rooms, waking him from his sleep. He painted a picture of a violent, armed insurrection, of his property being destroyed and his men being fired upon. He demanded a warrant for the arrest of May Carter, the ringleader of the seditious plot. That same morning, Reverend Hale stood on the steps of his chapel and watched as a small trickle of the new water reached the ditch that ran past the church grounds. He saw homesteaders running down to it, laughing, scooping up the clean, fresh water in their hands. He saw the life it brought, the hope it carried. For the first time, the words he had prepared for his Sunday sermon, words about order and property, felt like ash in his mouth. His gaze was troubled, the certainty he had held so tightly beginning to crumble like dry soil. Back at the tunnel, under a tense, unspoken truce, Luke and the homesteaders were allowed to carry Dr. Merriweather back toward town. The hired guns followed at a distance, their rifles ready. They were letting them go, but only as far as the sheriff's jail. May walked beside the makeshift stretcher, her mind racing. She could run. Luke could get her away. They could disappear into the hills, ride north, and never look back, But she looked at the wounded doctor, his face pale with pain but his eyes still defiant. She looked at the homesteaders, who walked with their heads held high despite the rifles aimed at their backs, and she knew she could not run. To run would be to admit guilt. To run would be to abandon the truth they had just risked their lives to unleash. She would not flee. She would walk into Red Butte, face her husband, face the law he owned, and she would do it in the full light of day, with the entire community as her witness. The water was free. Now, she had to be. The dawn broke like a bruise, staining the eastern sky in shades of purple and deep red. A cool mist, smelling of damp sagebrush and stone dust, clung to the floor of Red Butte Canyon, softening the sharp edges of the rock walls that rose like ancient sentinels on either side. The air was still and carried sound with a startling clarity. The tired shuffle of horses, the low groan of the wounded doctor, the clink of a spur on rock. They were taking Dr. Merriweather back to town, a slow, grim procession through the narrow pass that was the only way in or out. They saw them at the bend. Silas Van Dorn was waiting, astride his big black gelding. He was not alone. Sheriff Tolliver sat his horse beside him, his face puffy and nervous. Duke Moyer was there, his expression a mask of raw hatred. And with them were the 4 hired guns from Cheyenne, arrayed in a loose, deadly line, blocking the path completely. They held their rifles casually, but their stillness was more menacing than any open threat. It was a carefully prepared ambush. Van Dorn let them approach until they were 50 yards away, then raised a hand. His voice, when he spoke, was a cold, satisfied boom that echoed off the canyon walls. "That's far enough. May, I have a warrant for your arrest. For inciting a riot, destruction of property, and armed assault. It's over. Come along quietly, and I will see to it that your friends here are not charged as accomplices." Luke, who was leading the procession, reined in his horse. His face was a grim, unreadable mask, but his hand rested lightly on the worn grip of his pistol. The homesteaders behind him clutched their own assorted weapons, old hunting rifles and shotguns that were no match for the repeating rifles of the hired men. May looked from Van Dorn's triumphant face to the wounded doctor, whose breathing was shallow. This was the end of the line, a trap made of law and lead. But as she looked past the ambush, up on the high mesa that bordered the canyon, she saw movement, a flicker of gray, a flash of white. It was the wild herd, led by the lightning-marked stallion, grazing peacefully in the morning mist. An idea, born of desperation and a deep understanding of the land, sparked in her mind. She caught Luke's eye and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the mesa. He saw the horses, and his eyes, for a fraction of a second, widened in understanding. He was a man who thought in terms of movement and instinct, and he saw the desperate gambit she was proposing. Without a word, he turned his horse slightly, as if to calm it. He raised 2 fingers to his lips and let out a whistle. Not loud, but high and sharp, a perfect imitation of a mare calling to her stallion. The gray stallion's head shot up. He tested the wind. His ears pricked. Luke whistled again. A different note this time. A sound of alarm. The stallion responded instantly, with a wild, ringing neigh. He wheeled and plunged down the steep, scrub-covered slope that led into the canyon, his herd thundering at his heels. They came down like an avalanche of horseflesh, a storm of dust and hooves. Van Dorn's men, caught completely by surprise, yelled and fought to control their spooked mounts. The narrow canyon floor became a churning vortex of panicked animals. The hired guns were expert shots, but they could not shoot what they could not see. A thick, choking cloud of red dust filled the canyon, turning the world into a blind, roaring chaos. In that moment of confusion, May acted. The gray stallion, separated from his herd, had come to a skidding halt near her. His eyes were wild, but he recognized her scent, the memory of the quiet woman who had watched him for so many nights. She moved toward him, her hand outstretched, her voice a low, calming murmur that cut through the din. He trembled but stood his ground. She took hold of his tangled mane, then grabbed a rein on a nearby horse, and in a single, fluid motion, she was on his back. She had no saddle, no bridle, only her own will and the wild spirit of the horse beneath her. The dust began to settle. Through the swirling haze, Silas Van Dorn saw a sight that made his blood run cold. His wife, the woman he thought he had broken, sat astride the legendary wild stallion, the untamable spirit of the range. She was not fleeing. She was facing him, her back straight, her chin high, the embodiment of a freedom he could never own. Van Dorn's face contorted in a snarl of pure rage.
The law is on my side,
He roared, his voice cracking. I have the paper, I have the guns. May's voice, when she replied, was not loud, but it cut through the noise and the dust with the sharp clarity of breaking glass. The law is water. Mr. Van Dorn, she said, it always seeks the lowest ground, and the heart of a man is lowest before justice. The words were a judgment. Enraged, Duke Moyer finally broke free of the chaos. He raised his rifle, ignoring the horses, ignoring everything but the man he hated. He took aim at Luke. But before he could fire, another shot cracked from the mouth of the canyon behind them. It was not a rifle shot. It was the deep, distinctive boom of a heavy-caliber pistol. Duke cried out, a sound of shock and pain, and his rifle clattered to the ground. He stared in disbelief at his right hand, where a bloody hole had appeared through the fleshy part of his palm. Standing at the canyon entrance, smoke curling from the barrel of a Colt Peacemaker, was Jonas Pike. He was free. The deputy, true to his conscience, had not only looked the other way but had unlocked the cell door just before dawn. The tide had turned. Sheriff Tolliver, a man of bluster but no real courage, saw Jonas standing there, a figure of righteous fury, and he panicked. He yanked too hard on his reins, and his horse, already on edge, reared violently. The sheriff let out an undignified squawk and tumbled backward out of his saddle, landing in a heap in the dust. The 4 hired guns from Cheyenne took one look at the scene their employer's enforcer wounded, the sheriff unhorsed, and a determined blacksmith with a smoking gun, and made a swift, professional decision. They were paid to intimidate, not to die. They wheeled their horses and galloped away, disappearing up the canyon without a backward glance. Only Van Dorn was left. His face was a mask of disbelief. His small army had evaporated in seconds. He fumbled for his own pistol, his eyes wild with a cornered animal's fury. He would not be defeated. He would kill them all. He never got the chance. A single shot rang out, and Van Dorn's heavy pistol, yanked from his grasp as if by an invisible hand, flew through the air and landed in the dust 20 feet away. Luke sat calmly on his horse, his own gun smoking slightly. He had not shot the man. He had shot the leather gun belt strap clean through. Before Van Dorn could react, Luke was off his horse, covering the ground in 3 long strides. He slammed into Van Dorn, knocking the bigger man off his horse. They went down in a tangle of limbs. Luke, quicker and stronger, subdued him easily, twisting his arm behind his back and forcing his face into the dirt. Suddenly, a sound rose from the far end of the canyon, the sound of many voices, of dozens of men and women, the homesteaders, drawn by the miraculous sight of the new creek flowing from Cottonwood Hill, had come. They saw the scene before them, the disarmed tyrant, the disgraced sheriff, the wounded bully, and their champions. Standing victorious, they surged forward, their faces hard with generations of frustration and anger. May slipped off the stallion's back and quickly moved to stand between the crowd and the man on the ground. "No," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "We have not come this far to become what he is. We will have justice, not revenge." Just then, 2 more figures appeared. Reverend Hale, his face pale and conflicted, had come to see the final judgment, and behind him, walking with a grim purpose, was Rosa. She did not look at the Reverend. She looked at the crowd. "I think you all should hear this," Rosa said, her voice clear and strong. She held up a letter. Jonas found it in the sheriff's office, tucked away. "It is from Mr. Van Dorn to Reverend Hale." She began to read. The letter was short and direct. It spoke of a generous contribution to the church's new roof, to be paid upon the successful and legal acquisition of the Cottonwood Basin. It was a receipt for a man's soul. A dead silence fell over the canyon. Every eye turned to the Reverend, who seemed to shrink before them, his hypocrisy laid bare for all to see. The final actor in the drama then made his entrance, Judge Hargrove, drawn from his rooms by the sound of gunfire and the commotion, rode into the canyon. He took in the entire, incredible scene with a single sweeping glance. The community, united and armed, the captured Van Dorn, the incapacitated sheriff, the wounded Duke Moyer, and the letter still in Rosa's hand. He was a pragmatist. He saw that the balance of power in Red Butte had fundamentally and permanently shifted. He rode to the center of the crowd. "Sheriff Tolliver," he announced, his voice carrying the full weight of the law, "you are hereby suspended from your duties, pending an investigation into bribery and corruption. Silas Van Dorn. I am placing you under arrest for the willful destruction of a public water source, bribery of a public official, and assault with a deadly weapon." In the sudden, profound quiet that followed the judge's pronouncement, a new sound became clear. It was the gentle, steady murmur of running water, the voice of the freed creek echoing softly off the canyon walls. It was the sound of a verdict being rendered, a final judgment stamped upon the land. May let go of the stallion's mane. The great horse shook its head, gave a long, snorting breath, and then trotted away to rejoin its herd, its freedom reclaimed. Luke rose from the ground, leaving Van Dorn in the hands of the homesteaders. He walked to May's side. He did not take her hand. He did not need to. He simply stood there, his presence a solid and unwavering thing. as steady and reliable as a well-built fence. A new sound returned to Red Butte, a sound that had been missing for days, the rhythmic, reassuring clang of a hammer on steel. Jonas Pike had reopened his forge. The fire in the hearth burned bright and clean, and the sound of his work was a proclamation of resilience, a steady heartbeat for a town that was beginning to heal. On the porch of his office, his arm in a clean white sling, Dr. Merriweather tended to a line of patients with scrapes, coughs, and the mundane ailments that had been neglected during the crisis. He moved slowly, his face etched with pain, but his eyes were bright. He was a pillar of the community, wounded but unbroken. The center of the town's new life was the Cottonwood Well. The water, no longer overdrawn, ran clear and sweet. Rosa Delgado, with the help of a half-dozen other women, had set up a massive cast-iron pot over an open fire nearby. Into it went potatoes, carrots, onions, and chunks of beef donated from the homesteads. The smell of a rich, communal stew filled the air, a scent of fellowship and shared victory. People who had avoided each other's eyes for months now stood together, dipping tin cups into the pot, their conversations easy and open. The well, once a symbol of division and greed, had become their public square, a place of celebration. The change in the town's heart was palpable. One morning, May found a small, carefully wrapped package on the porch of the small house she had returned to. It was from the woman who had whispered the loudest about her trading her name for a roof. Inside was a block of salt, a precious commodity, and a short, awkwardly written note that said, "For your mother." Others followed: a sack of flour, a jar of preserved peaches, a handful of seeds for a garden. They were peace offerings, admissions of a shared blindness. The people of Red Butte were learning a new catechism, a truth that had been buried under fear and now flowed as freely as the water. What is essential for one is essential for all. Judge Hargrove, a man keenly attuned to the winds of change, moved to solidify the new reality into law. He convened a town meeting, not in the granary, but in the open air by the new, flowing creek. With the input of the homesteaders, he drafted a simple but revolutionary document, the Red Butte Public Water Compact. It declared that the Cottonwood Spring System was a community resource. Water rights would be registered publicly, with shares allocated based on need, not wealth. No single entity could ever again claim sole ownership. Each homesteader came forward to sign the document, their plain, work-hardened signatures a more powerful seal than any territorial stamp. The old order was dismantled piece by piece. Reverend Hale, his moral authority shattered, quietly packed his belongings and left on the morning train, his face a mask of shame. A letter was sent to the diocese requesting a new minister, one who understood that God's grace was not for sale. The former Sheriff Tolliver, stripped of his power and his benefactor, went through the ritual of handing his badge to the new, temporary lawman, a steady homesteader elected by the community. He did not speak, but his slumped shoulders and downcast eyes were a confession of his own pathetic corruption. The most symbolic departure was that of Silas Van Dorn. He was brought from the jail in irons, his fine suit now rumpled and stained with dust. He was to be taken by armed guard to Cheyenne to stand trial. He scanned the crowd, his eyes searching for fear, for some remnant of his old power, but he found none. The people of Red Butte looked back at him not with hatred, but with a kind of weary pity. He was just a man. His power and illusion they had allowed to exist for too long. As they put him on the train, he was no longer a titan. He was just a prisoner. His kingdom shrunk to the space between two steel handcuffs. That evening, May sat by her mother's bedside. The little house was quiet, filled with the gentle sounds of the summer night. The window was repaired, and a soft breeze stirred the curtains. She lit a single candle, its flame a small, steady light in the peaceful darkness. Her mother was sleeping, but her rest was different now. The frantic, shallow gasps were gone, replaced by a slow, even rhythm, The lines of pain on her face had softened. "I didn't sell my soul." "Mama," May whispered into the quiet room, though she knew her mother could not hear. "I didn't sign the paper." As if in response, her mother's hand, which lay on the quilt, twitched. May gently took it in her own. The old woman's fingers curled weakly but unmistakably around hers, a faint, reassuring pressure. Her breathing continued, soft and easy, a silent affirmation that the fever had finally broken. In the house and in the town. A few days later, when the sun was warm and the ground was still soft from a passing shower, Luke found May by the banks of the new Cottonwood Creek. He held out his hand. On his palm lay the small, familiar cloth sack. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, his voice gentle. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The simple weight of the seeds in her hand felt like the weight of a future she had not dared to imagine. "It belongs to us," she corrected him softly. They walked together along the freshly carved banks, the water chuckling over the stones beside them. They knelt in the dark, damp earth. Without needing to speak, they opened the sack and began to plant the seeds, pushing them one by one into the soil. It was a slow, deliberate act, a prayer offered with their hands. As they finished, the sky, which had been clear, clouded over. A soft, warm rain began to fall, pattering on the leaves of the cottonwood trees and dotting the surface of the creek, the air filled with the rich, hopeful scent of wet earth and new beginnings. The challenges of the land had not vanished. Rumors drifted in from passing travelers of a dry spell in the north, a new drought that was creeping down from the mountains. In the old days, such news would have been a death sentence, a harbinger of conflict and despair. But now, it was met with a quiet determination. The men of the community, led by Jonas, began digging irrigation ditches and reinforcing the creek banks to create a small reservoir. They were no longer at the mercy of the weather. They were partners with it. A new lightness had settled over Red Butte. In the evenings, the sound of a banjo and a fiddle drifted from the open doors of the Copper Spur Saloon, playing not the lonely dirges of the past, but lively, hopeful tunes. Children, their faces finally free from the pinch of thirst, ran laughing along the creek, trying to race the small wooden boats they had carved. On the low hills, the men practiced a system of signal flags, a way to communicate water levels and coordinate releases in case of a flash flood. They were a community not just of survivors, but of caretakers. From her porch, May would sometimes see him, the gray lightning-marked stallion, standing on a distant ridge, a wild, enduring reminder that some things could never be fenced. He was a part of their story now, a symbol of the freedom they had fought for and won. The late afternoon sun slanted across the valley, bathing the world in a soft, golden light. The air was warm and smelled of sun-baked earth and the sweet, green scent of the new grass that was beginning to carpet the banks of the Cottonwood Creek. The water itself ran so clear it looked like liquid glass, tumbling over the smooth, washed stones with a gentle, persistent murmur. It was the sound of life itself. Near the head of the creek, Luke Ramsey was driving new fence posts into the rich soil. He worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm, his movements economical and precise. But this was a different kind of fence. It was not a barrier of sharp, aggressive barbed wire designed to keep people out. It was a low, simple fence of smooth cedar posts and clean wire, built not to contain, but to guide. It followed the curve of the creek, a gentle suggestion to the cattle that this was the place to drink, a subtle reinforcement of the banks against the erosion of a sudden flood. It was a fence built in partnership with the land, not in defiance of it. May stood a short distance away, watching him. She had been visiting her mother, who was now able to sit up in a chair by the window, her hands busy with some mending, her face peaceful. The town was quiet, the hard edges softened by the promise of a peaceful evening. She watched Luke work, saw the way the sun lit his hair, the easy strength in his shoulders as he swung the heavy mallet. He was not a drifter anymore, A man who followed the seasons. He was putting down roots. Right here, in the soil they had fought for. He finished driving a post and straightened up, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He saw her watching, and a slow, easy smile touched his lips. He walked over to her, his boots making soft imprints in the new grass. "It is a good fence," she said, her voice as soft as the evening air. "It is a hopeful one," he replied. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, simply listening to the sound of the water, the music of their new world. He looked out over the valley, at the green shoots sprouting along the irrigation ditches, at the small, sturdy homes of the settlers, their windows beginning to glow with lamplight as dusk approached. "I waited a long time," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But I was not just waiting by doing nothing. I was waiting because I believed a day like this would come, a day when the land could breathe again." May smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that seemed to light her face from within. She reached out and touched his arm, the one that was still healing from the burn, and felt the solid warmth of him. "You were waiting for the rain," she said softly, "and I was learning how to build clouds." He turned to face her, his blue eyes serious, filled with a deep, unwavering emotion that made her heart beat a little faster. He had waited so long, had loved her so patiently, from a distance, with a quiet honor that was the very core of who he was. Now, the waiting was over. He reached into the pocket of his worn denim shirt, and his hand came out, closed in a fist. He hesitated for a moment, as if the thing he held was both impossibly heavy and incredibly fragile. He opened his hand. Lying on his calloused palm was a ring. It was not gold or silver. It was a simple, dark band of iron, forged by Jonas Pike. It was not perfectly round or polished smooth, but it was strong and true, and etched into its surface, with the fine tip of a file, was a single, perfect teardrop, a drop of water. He did not make a grand speech. His words were as simple and honest as the ring itself. He went down on one knee, not in a gesture of supplication, but in a gesture of profound respect, his knee sinking into the soft, green grass that had been born from their struggle. He looked up at her, and his heart was in his eyes. "May Carter," he said, his voice thick with a lifetime of unspoken love. "If you will have me, I will wait until I am old and gray to hear this water running beside our home." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of overwhelming joy, of a release so profound it felt as if a dam inside her had finally broken. She knelt down in front of him, so their eyes were level. "I will have you Luke Ramsey," she whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out and touched the iron ring. "But our home will have a gate, and it will always be open for anyone who is thirsty." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Their wedding, a few days later, was not held in a church. There was no white lace dress, no solemn organ music, no pealing of bells. They were married in the open air, beside the creek, under the vast, benevolent Wyoming sky. May wore a simple blue dress, the color of a clear horizon, and in her hair, she wore her mother's silver pin. The only decoration was a single, wide blue ribbon, the same color as her dress, tied around the new fence post where Luke had proposed. It fluttered in the breeze, a small, bright flag of their new beginning. Their guests were the family they had forged in the fire, Jonas Pike, his massive hands scrubbed clean. Standing as Luke's witness, Rosa Delgado, her face beaming with a fierce, maternal pride. Standing as May's, and Dr. Merriweather, his arm still in a sling but his voice strong and clear. He was their minister. He did not read from a book. He held his good hand up to the sky and offered a simple, three-word blessing that encompassed everything they had fought for. "Water," he said, "light, truth." Luke and May joined hands. They did not need to say vows. Their promises had already been made, in the darkness of a collapsing tunnel, in the smoke of a burning barn, in the quiet courage of a public hearing. Their commitment was written on the land itself. As they stood there, hand in hand, a sound carried on the wind from the high ridge. It was the sharp, clear neigh of a stallion. They all looked up. On the crest of the hill, silhouetted against the brilliant blue sky, stood the wild gray horse, the lightning mark on his eye a slash of white against the sun. He tossed his head, his mane flying, and let out a long puff of white breath into the cool air. He seemed to be watching them, a wild king surveying his peaceful domain. May felt a deep, resonant connection to the creature. She met its distant gaze, and it felt like a final, silent blessing. He was the spirit of this place, a freedom that could never be shod, never be broken. The small group began to walk back toward the town, where a celebration feast was waiting. But the narrator's eye lingers, pulling back, letting the couple fade into the landscape. The human voices grow faint, replaced by the eternal sounds of the land. The wind whispers through the new grass. A hawk circles in the endless sky, and the creek, the heart of it all, continues its steady, faithful journey, telling the rest of the story in a language older than words. Every generation has its own kind of barbed wire. They chose to take it down with hands that did not tremble. Freedom is not a gift given to the obedient. Justice is a seed that sprouts only when a community stands together to water it. And love, the truest love, is a thing that matures not just in waiting, but in acting, in building, in planting seeds in the damp, hopeful earth, together. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to support us so this story can be heard by more people.